Welcome back to the Dementia Collective, the podcast where we explore powerful stories and fresh ideas shaping the future of dementia care. If you're new here, my name is Andrew Karesa. I'm a caregiver, researcher, and founder of BlueBell Village. I created this space because I know firsthand what it's like to walk the dementia caregiving journey. I know what it's like to feel lost, overwhelmed, alone, but I also know the strength that comes from connection. Each episode, we dive into people, tools, and innovations that are helping caregivers find their footing and their voice. Our mission here, to make dementia care more personal, more connected, and more grounded in Indigenous ways of knowing. The importance is ensuring that every caregiver feels seen, heard, and supported. Today, I'm excited to be sharing with you Anoushka Fernandes, founder of Marcelino Maurice Solutions. Anoushka is born and raised Edmontonian who is proudly of Goan heritage and active promoter of the South Asian diaspora in Edmonton. In 2023, she made the decision to leave full-time corporate role and create Marcelino Maurice Solutions, a corporate governance consultancy, to have more time to support her dad in caregiving for her mother, who suffered from dementia and has since passed on. She is a past client of Caregivers Alberta and Alzheimer's Society of Alberta and Northwest Territories. She is a passionate advocate for increasing dementia awareness and understanding within South Asian communities and women caregivers. She wants to help undo the stigma of dementia within cultural communities to ensure families seek formal diagnoses and assess critical early stage treatment and interventions, which can be so beneficial to quality of life for both dementia patients and those who care for them. In October 2025, she launched her website, the Soggy Sandwich, to support other dementia caregivers as well as those who have experienced dementia-related loss. Welcome, Anoushka. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks very much for the invitation.
So we have a Patreon, and we allow members of the village on our Patreon channel to get to ask questions to the guests that we have coming up. We allow them to ask at least one. Sometimes we, get a couple really good ones. I'm like, yeah, throw a couple more in. So, but today we have one that I think is pinnacle for kind of what we're going to be talking about. So we'll get into it. So the member of the villager said, what do Canadian caregivers need to know about caring for someone from a South Asian country living with dementia?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and thanks for that. So I think part of my passion in trying to raise awareness of dementia in cultural communities, especially the South Asian community, is because from a very young age, and especially for those of us that are first-generation Canadians and children to those who came over in that great wave of immigration in the 1970s, there was a plan written for us before we even got here. Our parents had deliberately come to a new country because they wanted a better life for their kids. And so the culture of achievement is very, very strong, and we don't like to talk about failure. We don't use the word failure, and we certainly don't like to talk about anything that's not perfect. And so I think the first battle that we've got to overcome is having people acknowledge the fact that dementia is something that can happen even if you have lived your life in a way to take into account all of the lifestyle indicators that would keep your risk low. And certainly that was the case with my mother. We need to normalize the conversation around the fact that this disease is projected to affect a huge number of Canadian seniors over the next 25 years. As our general life expectancy has gone up, and as the number of seniors that are going to make up the percentage of the Canadian population continues to increase, there's going to be a huge demand on systems for services, caregiving supports, and treatments. And so I would say that the South Asian community is certainly not monolithic. There are a variety of languages, cultures, religious traditions, and a whole bunch of other factors that go into it. So I know one of the things that you have talked a lot about, Andy, is the concept of person-centered care. It's good to have that general awareness, but every dementia patient is different in terms of the symptoms they're battling, the struggles that they may have in their day-to-day lives, or even how quickly people may progress through the different stages. And so I think the first step is just acknowledging the fact that this is going to be a very widespread disease. It is going to affect people from a lot of different backgrounds, including those who aren't going to want to deal with it head on, may be pushed into that denial or that sense of shame. And so the more that we can normalize this and the more that we talk about it and the more we remove any feelings of guilt behind it, the more successful families are going to be.
Do you think that there is a significant stigma, not just in initial diagnosis, but in the actual delivery of care when caring for someone from the South Asian community?
Yeah, quite possibly. So in my case, we're of Goan heritage. That's, Goa is often known as India's party capital. It's a former Portuguese colony, so it's very Christian. It's quite liberal in terms of its culture and its traditions. My father's first language is Portuguese. My mother's first language is English. So there weren't as many barriers, I'm going to say, to accessing mainstream services that potentially other families might experience where English isn't a first language, or there are very specific religious or cultural differences between what mainstream Canada has. So we didn't experience that. But I think the whole concept around making people understand that this disease is universal, it picks its victims in no particular way, we can all be subject to it, is just a really important discussion point.
So can we take a step back and I think go into your growing up process? So your parents are both from India, correct?
Yes.
And so what was it like growing up as a Goan child here in Edmonton?
Yeah. So, I like the fact that you kind of ask all of your guests about their origin stories, because I think the more that we reflect on where we come from, the better we're able to understand how we are going to personally respond to major problems or crisis points in our life, like managing dementia can be, because it is a chronic degenerative. And I'm not even too sure that the science has settled on whether we call it a disease, a condition, a disability. We're still trying to figure out what it is. So in terms of my perspective, I'm the oldest child, like I said, of immigrant parents. And so there was definitely a story written for me before I got here. And like most other children, I strongly believe that my younger sister got away with absolute, murder. But, for me personally, I always had a really strong interest in meeting people and building relationships. And so throughout my youth, I put a lot of emphasis on studying different languages, doing a lot of travel, understanding different religions, because I just always thought it was very interesting to understand how people come through things from different ways. So unintentionally and without knowing it, I guess I engaged in what would now be formally called intercultural studies. And I started my career in the nonprofit sector, moved through the private sector, and then came to work for the government of Alberta in what I thought was going to be a very short stint. But as I jokingly say, I blinked and 20 years had gone by. So, growing up as a person of Goan heritage in Edmonton, when I was very young, there were maybe 35 to 40 Goan families in the greater Edmonton area. We all knew each other. The association was very strong. And now you fast forward a couple of decades, and with immigration patterns, there's probably upwards of 500 Goan heritage families in the city. I don't know very many of them at all, but you just think of how things have changed from the time when my parents first came over. Calling back home to talk to grandpa was, $5 a minute, right? You could really only see people if you saved up the money to go there in person, because social media and technology like FaceTime simply didn't exist. You were still writing letters in the mail. And so relationships were a lot different, and you had to be a lot more intentional about how you kept those connections. Whereas today, it's a lot easier to maintain those relationships because of technology and even the greater accessibility of things like air travel. So, it's provided a really interesting reflection point for me on I grew up within mainstream Canadian society and tried to keep a foot in both cultures. And as we noticed mom's memory changes, I was really grateful for the fact that my parents were both very open about talking about what mom was going through. Mom was very frustrated by the fact that she knew her memory was changing and there was really nothing anybody could do about it. And so I think that knowing something is wrong and not being able to do anything is probably one of the most horrible things. It was hard for us. I can't imagine what she went through in that knowledge. But the more open we were about our story, I think the more it encouraged people in our circle to think about this, especially from the perspective of relatives or friends that they thought might be struggling with something similar, and really encourage them to be open to go and seek those formal diagnoses that then enable you to access certain supports. Because, as you said in your intro, part of the reason that I'm so passionate about doing this is the longer you wait, the longer you spend in denial, or the more you want to believe something isn't wrong, the more time you're wasting in a stage of the disease where people can actually benefit from some of the early intervention treatments. Unfortunately, this is a disease where when you get to a certain state, you just become focused on comfort. Quality of life maybe is a step that you've now missed the opportunity to do something about. And so the earlier we talk about what the impact of this disease is and how to manage it, the better it's going to be for the patient and the easier it's going to be for the family around them.
Were you connected and intimately involved with your grandparents growing up? You mentioned you would have to fly there and you couldn't call often because it was $5 a minute. Were you connected to them and involved in their life and they were involved in yours in any
Yeah,
extent?
absolutely. And I know these days family is a very touchy subject for people because not everyone has a great relationship with theirs. But I'm very fortunate that growing up, my mom was very diligent about making sure that my sister and I wrote regular letters to our grandparents that were in India. My dad's parents had immigrated to Canada and lived in Edmonton as well. So we had one set of grandparents that was here. And building that family connection was really important because I think I'm a mom now to preteen kids that are asking for phones on a weekly basis, and we've made the decision to hold off on giving them to them. But you think of these technologies and these social medias were meant to bring us together and to make the world a smaller place. And in some ways, they absolutely have. And there's been a lot of good that has come out of the internet and social media campaigns. But it's also fostered a growing sense of isolation, right? And being alone. And so I'm really grateful that there was a really strong sense instilled in me that family is important because when things go wrong, this is going to be your community that you can turn to for support and for help. And I'm really grateful that it's something that I continue to cultivate as an adult because, as I'm sure we'll talk about a bit later, my mom died very suddenly of a, random heart attack, basically. And the outpouring of support that we've received from our circle of family and friends has been so helpful in getting us through, a very difficult first couple of months.
Did you find that your caring of your mother was in any way um, a reflection of the care that you learned seeing your grandparents age?
Percent. So, I mean, if I can just talk a little bit about the decisions that I've made over the past couple of years in my career was starting to struggle with memory issues. You kind of in that period where we were just starting to come out of COVID. And I didn't want to believe it because, just for context, at the time, my mom was the most highly educated member of our family. She had completed a master's in English literature. She had taught university in India prior to moving to Canada. She was in excellent physical condition. She practiced yoga almost every day from the time she was 18, right up until a couple of days before her death. She could do things with her body that, me being much younger, I couldn't even dream of doing. She was very, very diligent about nutrition and how she prepared meals. Her favorite pastime was doing crosswords. She learned Portuguese in her 40s so that when my parents made regular trips to Portugal, she could better engage in conversation. So she did all of the things that you're supposed to do. And this still affected her. So it was really hard for all of us to process. There was a huge sense of this is really unfair. Why is the universe doing this to her? Why has this disease picked her? She doesn't deserve this. She lived her life in a way that she should have been home free from this kind of a medical risk. And so when I was in my career, I had achieved a fairly senior position within the Alberta Public Service. Absolutely, I wanted to be there for my parents, not because of any obligation, but because, I genuinely feel that they did everything they could to set me up with the best possible life. Why would I not want to return the favor for them now? And so initially, I had started a conversation about how could I reduce my hours and formally not be a full-time person, but just a little bit shy of that. Unfortunately, that wasn't really an option available to me. And so it was suggested, well, perhaps you can take some vacation days and then, you can only work 4 days a week, be on vacation for 1 day a week. We tried that for a couple of months and it really wasn't working out. There was always some sort of pull on my time on that day I was supposed to be off. And so I got to the point where I realized I had a decision to make. I could either keep going in my career and keep everything the way that it was, or I could make some changes to feel like I was doing more to support my dad in caring for my mom, because it didn't take long to notice that she was struggling and it was getting harder for her to do things on a daily basis. And I can only imagine how hard that was for my dad when your partner of over 4 decades is now starting to struggle with some of these basic things, and having a conversation is a bit more challenging because it repeats a lot more. I didn't want him to have to deal with that on his own. Maybe one of the things we'll talk about a bit later too is I am so wanting to help employers understand how this disease is going to affect their workforce. I'm part of Generation X. I was born in the 1970s. And so I feel in some ways I'm part of the first cohort that we call the sandwich generation. But as we delay having kids in life and as our parents are living longer, every generation that comes after us is going to move into this slot at some point in their lives. And I just don't think we're ready for how are we going to deal with that from a workforce perspective when people come to these crossroads and go, what am I going to do? I need to have a career, but I also need to look after my family. And I don't know that the individuals themselves are prepared for the fact that in most cases, governments, and I'm not, putting any one party or any order of government under the microscope here, but in general, governments are fully expecting that families are going to be the first line of defense. Know how sustainable that is. It's something that's very emotionally taxing. It definitely takes a lot of your attention and your resources, and it's not something that we're prepared to deal with systematically. So I think the more that we can have these conversations, the better.
I think the system needs to be implemented where if folks are taking the time off to care for their loved one and, be that primary caregiver, the expectation is not that it will be a free service. I mean, we have, I think Tom Douglas, established Canada's free healthcare system. And because we have that, we shouldn't be saying caregivers give everything up and provide free service. Like, we have free healthcare. Why are we not compensating the individuals that are leaving their full-time employment to look after a loved one? There should be some level of support for them. I know Dr. Sharon Anderson's talked about it before, about how do we support Alberta folks, getting compensated so that they can continue to provide the best level of care, so we don't have to keep relying on the system. As she said at the show, we can't build our way out of this problem.
Yeah,
And I think it's so
100%.
true.
And I know that there are stats that Caregivers Alberta has done, the Alzheimer's Society of Canada has done on just what is the economic impact of caregiving. And it's a phenomenally high number. One of the other things that I think we have to reckon with is the fact that traditionally in the Western world, quite broadly, our medical and healthcare systems have been set up to respond to problems or to respond to crisis. They're not generally set up to help in proactive planning for these kinds of long-term chronic conditions. And the more that we see them, the more we're seeing what a gap that we've got in terms of how do we help people prepare for something that is going to just be a part of the rest of their lives versus a distinct incident that needs to be responded to, one time with treatment.
Reactive is significantly easier, which is why I think that institutions rely on it. You have incident, you have response, we move along, versus where do you draw the line of where the support starts and where it ends, where it is directly correlated to this other thing. It's complicated, and I think you need a philosophical shift in order to address it. We
And,
need to
I think we've made such great strides in cancer, and I don't want to overgeneralize because I am very lucky that I haven't had a personal experience with that disease. But in general, you look at how cancer treatments have progressed over the past couple of decades. And so now, in most cases, when you get some sort of a diagnosis, it's no longer a death sentence. There's an established protocol of treatments that you can follow. There's a lot of medications that you can take. There's a lot of services in the space to help people rehabilitate and get back to normal. Dementia is throwing a real wrench into that because there is no established progression for patients. We have a general idea of some of the stages that people will go through, but one person might be in early stage for 3 months and then progress to very severe. My mother lived with a very early stage symptoms for the full 3 years that she was battling the disease until, like I said, a random act of cardiac arrest took her life in her sleep. So there's no real set progression or expectation of how people are going to inhabit any of the symptoms. And that makes it even more challenging to deal with because even from a caregiving perspective, the monthly support groups that I attended at the Alzheimer's Society of Alberta and Northwest Territories were hugely helpful in terms of broadening my awareness of things that could happen. But there was never any guarantee that what someone had talked about in January was going to be, something that I would experience in June. Maybe mom was never going to have those symptoms, or maybe she was going to have something totally different that nobody else in the group had experienced.
When you think about your time with your mother and your father, frankly, being both from India, how did the conversations about aging and illness show up? Did they happen? Did you guys talk about it? Or was it we don't talk about those things at all? The expectation is that you'll care for us and otherwise we don't talk about it.
We never, like most families, we didn't plan for this at all. We just learned how to deal with it when it happened. I think, my parents have now been, my father has been in Canada for 50 years now. And so while we try to stay true to some of the cultural traditions, I think that we're very much part of the modern Western world, which has done such a good job of prolonging lifespans that we try to deny aging in any of its senses, right? We don't want to act like we're getting old. People don't want to say how old they are. They don't want to celebrate their birthdays. There's a cosmeceutical industry that's worth billions of dollars this continent because we want to do everything that we can to retain the appearance of youth. And so when aging confronts us, it's very uncomfortable because we don't know how to deal with it. We've tried to deny it out of existence. And so with my parents, when dad first made the observations, like I said, I went straight into denial. I wanted to believe that, he was stressed out. And so he was maybe exaggerating things that he was observing with mom. And it wasn't until I started to experience things with my own eyes, I went, oh my God, maybe there is something to this and we need to maybe seek some medical attention. I'm really grateful for the fact that just based on the personalities of my mom, my dad, and me, we're not people that take no for an answer or not having an answer. And so we were very vocal about leveraging our friends and family that work in the healthcare system to ask a bunch of questions and figure out, okay, what do we do next? How do we get mom in for testing? What's the value in having a diagnosis? What are the services that are available to us? All in the face of a healthcare system that, quite frankly, we'd never needed to interact with because we're very fortunate that we've all been very healthy and our immediate circle has had to manage a chronic illness or a diagnosis before. This really was our first time. And so when you are there trying to navigate your way through the monolith that is Alberta Health Services, it's really terrifying because you don't know where to start. There's no obvious navigation path to go in. And so it really was a lot of trial and error, asking a lot of questions. And then as we gain the knowledge, sharing it among ourselves as a family, trying to make sure that we were all informed about what was happening and then figuring out how to go through next steps together.
Do you think that your South Asian heritage really led you down the road of we're not just going to try and, lock your mom up. Instead, you want to take it on yourself and figure out a solution to care for
I don't think I
yourself?
started, helping dad to manage all of mom's situation with any idea of some sort of bigger crusade in mind. It really was about, okay, this is my mom. This is my mom. I love her. I care for her. I don't like watching her struggle with the things that she's struggling with. How do we get her help? As we got onto that train and became more informed and built our community, we then kind of started talking about, I think other people that we know have struggled with this, but they never talked about it out loud. It would be really helpful if we showed that leadership, if you want to say, and we're really open about the story so that we help other people to not feel uncomfortable about engaging with mom, because there definitely was a perceptible personality change that happened with her in terms of her willingness to proactively engage in social environments and opportunities. And so we wanted to help people explain that and not make them feel uncomfortable about interacting with her. And as we went through and I got the idea of building this website, if I can just take a minute to share that journey, I've started my own consulting company. One of the areas that I support organizations with is staff engagement and helping employers prepare for the very vocal demands of younger workers. And I think as they age and move into this sandwich generation cohort, that's going to be a real consideration that I don't think workplaces are ready for writ large. And so as I was thinking about how can I put the knowledge and the research that I've done to use for the benefit of others, because I knew how daunting it was to try and start navigating this issue myself. I came up with the idea of building a dementia support website, and I was really grateful that, I was able to have the conversation with both my mom and dad in the summer about what I was wanting to do. I talked to my dad about, okay, you're going to be able to review the material that I'm putting up because I don't ever want you to be uncomfortable about the stories that I'm sharing, but I do want it to be a place where other people cannot feel so alone. As I've listened to your podcast as well, Andy, I know that you talk about that the isolation of caregiving can be really frightening as well, especially if you're not in a circle of friends that are going through the same thing. And so I put together this website and I was all ready to launch it on September the 1st to mark World Alzheimer's Month. Well, mom died on August the 28th, and in the complete shock and grief and needing to get things done in terms of estate administration, planning a funeral that we had never counted on, and all the rest of it, I wasn't sure that I wanted to go ahead, but then I thought, well, I've paid for this domain, I've paid for the hosting, I might as well put it to the use of other people. And so I'm really glad that I did launch it, because it started small and I've just kind of been promoting it through word of mouth so far. But some of the feedback that I've had so far has been so gratifying to know that it is making a difference, helping people to not feel alone, maybe validating some of the feelings that they have, because dementia is all of the emotions, maybe not all at the same time, but you definitely go through the full gamut, in the course of a year. And I'm really glad that I put it out there to try and build a bit of a community and encourage other people to be more open about what it is that they're facing. Because like I said, the projections are there. This disease is going to affect an alarming number of Canadians over the next 25 years.
Can you share some feedback or reflection of how this Soggy Sandwich and your advocacy work has impacted the South Asian community? Has anyone talked to you about that?
I think the biggest thing has been I'm really keen on sharing resources. So, for example, I didn't even know how to access home care supports through Alberta Health Services. And I know that the system has changed and the agency names are a lot different now. But at the time that we were going through it, I learned that you don't need to have a diagnosis to access home care supports. I was waiting for a diagnosis so that someone could, give me a manual and say, great, you have dementia. Here's what you do now. That didn't happen. And over the course of my making contact with the person that ended up being assigned to our family and the questions that I asked, I became aware of all of these programs and resources that are available to families. And we were very assertive about making sure that mom got as many of those provided to her as possible. And they really did make a huge difference in the last year of her life. So I'm very grateful for that. But people don't know that these things are even out there. And so by providing those resources and letting people know there is a path to getting help, you don't need to go this alone. And you don't necessarily need to pay for all of it out of pocket. I think one of the things that Dad and I were most concerned about was trying to plan for a stage where mom was potentially not going to be able to continue to live in their house. Private care is hugely expensive, $5,000 to $7,000 a month. I don't know a lot of families that can afford that. And so, when you talk about getting the system ready, what are we going to do with all of these people when they get to a point where maybe their tendency to violent outbursts or very erratic behavior makes it really difficult for them to live in the house, or when they became a safety concern to themselves or others because of, wandering or getting up in the middle of the night and doing things. How are we going to account for this population? I think that's a conversation we still need to figure out.
If we can take a step back to your mom's early awareness so that there was something going on, what indications did you guys have, or that your dad had, that something was going on with your mom that needed to be evaluated?
The first conversation that he had with me was after dinner one Sunday. My parents have been coming over to my family's house for Sunday dinner ever since my husband and I got together. And a couple of years ago in the summer, he pulled me aside and he said, "I think Mom is starting to struggle with her memory." And of course, "No, she's not. No, she's not. You're exaggerating." And he told me a story that really stuck with me, that one morning they'd gotten up and my mom really likes to make kind of fancy breakfasts on the weekend. And Dad said, "Oh, why don't you just make those scrambled eggs?" And apparently she turned to him and said, "Right. How do I do that?" And it was just one of those, huh? My mom had two offices. One was sitting at the piano playing music, and the other one was in the kitchen. She was an amazing cook. And for him to say that was just so startling, because you kind of go, "What do you mean? How do you make scrambled eggs? You've been doing this your whole life." And so that was one of the first comments that made me go, "I think we're going to have to think about this." And so it was things like that. And once you become aware that there might be a problem, I think you're more heightened in looking for further manifestations of that. And there were a couple of times that she was over, she came over once a week to give my kids a piano lesson and just sort of hang out while my dad was at the gym. And there was one time where we were eating dinner and Mom was going to wait for Dad, but she was sitting at the breakfast bar. There were 5 people, but only 4 seats. And so my husband was standing kind of eating as he was, putting some stuff away and things. And my mom must have asked him in the span of a half hour at least 10 times, "Oh, do you want to sit down?" And it wasn't from the, no, you sit down and I'll stand. It was, I don't know how to explain it, but it really felt like she hadn't remembered that she had previously asked the question. And that was a little disconcerting for me as well, because I just thought, do you not remember that we've had this conversation? And that was kind of the start of, I think we need to go talk to a doctor and figure out what's going on.
In those early days, how did your family talk about it? Was there any stigma associated with this memory loss? Were there things you guys didn't talk about? You're like, we all can acknowledge that this is happening, but we don't want to put the D word, as people call it, or what was it like?
Yeah, I think those first couple of months were a bit of a jumble of me refusing to believe that my dad's stories were true, and me really just not wanting to believe it, because I think the process of watching your parents age is a difficult one. I'm very close with my parents, and so I see them a lot. It's hard when you get to the age and that basically you have to confront their mortality, and I think by extension your own. It's not a comfortable place to be. And so the first couple of months was, okay, maybe something is happening, but maybe it's not, consulting Dr. Google a lot and learning about this thing called mild cognitive impairment, which was the first diagnosis Mom received in the spring of 2023, and trying to explain it away, right? Trying to downplay it. "Oh, maybe this isn't so bad. Oh, okay. Well, this is part of the aging process. She's in her 70s. And, to my earlier point about we've denied aging so much, when I would tell people about Mom's diagnosis, "Oh, how old is she?" "Well, she's 75. That's so young." And, our whole perception around what age is has really shifted, right? I mean, 75 is actually not young. It is an older person. But in our perception of what lifespans are like and what we expect people in their 70s to do, I think we have, to a certain degree, convinced ourselves that things shouldn't be happening, even though, it's just a fact of life. The body does start to break down after a while. I would say that between my dad and me, there was a lot of internet research happening, a lot of informal conversations. When we finally decided to seek medical diagnosis, and even my first exposure to the testing process seemed very rudimentary and kind of Mickey Mouse. And why are you asking these really stupid questions? Do you not have any respect for what my mom has achieved in her life? Like, don't treat her like a child, kind of a thing. It was difficult for sure. But once we had that formal diagnosis, and then when we saw and experienced the symptoms change, in my mom's case, it seemed quite rapidly over 3 successive summers. I don't know what it was about the summertime, but that seemed to be the time of year where we noticed 3 consecutive years of decline. You can at that point continue to deny it, but in our case, it was always about how do we give mom the best possible treatment and maintain her quality of life for as long as possible.
Oftentimes, that's a hard thing to track the progression because if it happens so slowly over such a long period of time, you just normalize the trajectory. And you might say, it's not that much. It's not that much. Then you take a step back. And if you have some way of, tracking that and being able to say, this is what it was this January, then August, and then September, and you start tracking it this way, it's interesting to see what that trajectory actually looks like. Oftentimes we miss that.
Yeah, so I do project management as part of my job. And so I love records and data. And I first started documenting my mother. I think it was the summer of 2023. That's where I really wanted to start regularly exchanging information with my dad. I created a whole folder in my email system for my mom's health because for me, exactly to your point, I thought, okay, maybe it's going to stay at MCI for the rest of her life. That's unfortunate, but if that's what we're dealing with, I at least want to make sure that we're tracking, any changes to her medication, any kind of behaviors that we're observing. By that point, I was also involved with the Alzheimer's Society and sort of regularly attending the support group. So as you become more aware of how the disease affects other people, you start to get a better sense of, okay, what might I be in for? I was doing a lot more reading at that point as well to kind of prepare myself. I'm a planner. I like to have everything, known. And so this disease was a real challenge to my whole way of being because it's not something that you can prepare for, even in terms of, my dad and I were madly trying to put aside money and figure out how are we going to manage this financial obligation that's going to hit us when we get to the point that mom's no longer to live in the house. It didn't come to pass. And, it's hard because we had no time to prepare for mom's departure. In fact, the night before she died, we had booked family photos and we had a beautiful sitting of family photos in the park with a friend of ours who's a photographer, had a great evening. She saw the kids. If you had to script, someone's exit from this world, you really couldn't have done a more perfect job because mom didn't suffer. It was instantaneous, but it was just such a shock to the system. I would give anything to have her back. But the more I reflect on it too, and I've had these conversations with my dad, we're so grateful that in many ways we were spared from the really ugly side of this disease that can come the longer people are living with it. And certainly, folks in my support group were experiencing some really scary sounding symptoms that we just didn't have to go through with mom. So, you never know what cards you're going to be dealt. And you just try to work through the best that you can.
What was the hardest part that you went through as a caregiver?
This sense of great injustice in the universe that this disease picked my mom and she did nothing to deserve it. And in fact, lived her life in a way that this shouldn't have come to her at all. That was, I think I spent a couple of years in anger. And I actually remember this past June saying to my husband, okay, I think I'm done with anger. Anger's not doing anything anyway. I'm just going to move on to acceptance and try to figure out how we best manage this. And so I think the anger, the feelings of guilt about, and especially since mom has died, I've just been consumed by, did I do enough? Did I do the right things? Was I too hard on her? Did I not have enough patience? I think, that's something that is just a natural part of dealing with this condition. So I'd say, grief, anger, guilt, that's a part of this ride. It's a not pleasant part of the ride, but it is. I think the other thing that was really hard was watching my own mother struggle and knowing that she knew that something was wrong. She knew that she couldn't remember things. She was so frustrated by this. And it's really hard. I've listened to a couple of other podcasts where people have shared you're never prepared to hear your mother, of all people, say something like, well, I should just die then. There's no point to me staying around. Like, that's an awful thing to hear. And it was devastating the very first time she said that to me. Unfortunately, she would go on to say it a few more times. And I just came to accept it as, part of her frustration and how she was expressing that. It was hard for me as a caregiver. I can't imagine what was going on in her own mind. But yeah, that was an absolutely horrific part of the journey. But it's I've tried to explain to people dementia is like a brain injury, right? Your brain is not operating the way that it's supposed to, the way that it was trained to. There is something in there that is blocking proper functioning, whether that's regulation of emotion or being able to recall things. And it's something that we need to prepare ourselves to manage, because I think one of your previous guests had said that over the past 20 years, dementia has been something that used to affect 1 in 5 people and now affects, what is it, 1 in 2 or 1 in 3? Like, that's a huge change. And that ratio is just going to keep getting smaller as we go.
It's expected to grow exponentially between now and 2050, and I would suspect after that, projections aren't there. Were there any moments that were great that you look back and say, you know what, I wouldn't have had this opportunity had my mother not been going through this?
I don't want to sound like a cliche, I probably will, but I think, when you're forced to confront something like this, I certainly took the opportunity to say, okay, what is it that I want out of my career and with my time left on earth, right? And so for me, that was making a pretty radical career change, leaving a very comfortable job with a very good salary to step into the world of the unknown when it comes to small business ownership and entrepreneurship, and giving up some stability financially for who knew what was going to come. But I think it was something that I'm really glad that I did. And, certainly some of my friends it's been nice to hear them say that they're really proud of me for what I did, because it was a hard decision. It wasn't easy. I'm in a marriage. It was something that I had to talk through with my husband. I don't think he was super excited about it at first. Because it changes the dynamic. It changes your ability to do things that, once you're used to a certain standard of living, that is maybe going to be compromised for the first little bit as you make these changes. But I'm really glad that I took the time to think about what is the relationship that I want to have to time, right? And for me, I couldn't balance what I needed to balance by staying in the traditional job that I had. Never in a million years would have I believed that I was making this major change within what would become the last few years of my mom's life. I thought this was something we were going to be living with for a very, very long time. So it was also about preparing myself of how am I going to be able to manage my own sanity and physical and mental health while I'm dealing with a really challenging situation, helping my kids through it, still being a member of my family unit while I'm trying to provide this support. And so, yeah, I'm really glad that I made the change.
How did you determine where to start looking for help and support and information?
So, one of the things that really struck me when Dad and I first started our research is that there are a lot of really great information supports available through the Mayo Clinic or other American sources, but it was really hard to find made in Alberta information. And so I'm grateful that the doctors that we worked with, both our family doctor and the geriatric clinic that we got referred to at the Glenrose Hospital here in Edmonton, were very helpful with steering us towards things like the home care system. And, we had an absolutely amazing home care worker who was so helpful in pointing us to various resources, including putting me in touch with the Alzheimer's Society. I'd heard of them peripherally, but I didn't really know what they did. And the more that I engaged with them and their courses and their library of materials and the support groups, the more conversations it opened up to me. I think that's how we came to be connected as well, Andy, is, just through LinkedIn and my searching for things related to dementia. I found out about the app that you're developing, and I signed up to be a beta tester as we, tried to figure out how were we going to manage all of the information pieces that were coming to us from different sources so that we had one single point to go to for mom.
So I know you do a very good job of searching for information, refining information, qualifying what information is good, relevant, and helpful versus just background noise. How would you advise other caregivers to do that?
First thing I'd say is don't try to do it on yourself. Try to seek out a community of support. I was able to participate in caregiver support groups through both Caregivers Alberta and the Alzheimer's Society, and those avenues were hugely helpful for me. Caregivers Alberta even has a program called Caregiver Coaching. I had an amazing coach I had a couple of sessions with, and by explaining my story in detail, she referred me to a whole pile of other books, podcasts, ideas for medical treatment, ideas for questions to ask our healthcare providers. So don't try to do everything on your own. This is also a disease that is, I'm going to say, in its emerging stages of being well known and well spoken about. And so there are things that are changing all the time. And the more people that you can surround yourself with that are in the same boat, the more access you're going to have to different ideas. Because as I mentioned before, this disease affects every single person so differently. So you don't know what you're going to get until you're actually dealing with it. So the more avenues you've got to explore what's out there, the better.
That's the thing. It is so different for every person. It's complicated, especially caregivers, when there's so much information out there. Figuring out where do you start looking? How do you discern what will work and what won't work? Especially for the the multicultural communities.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, the internet in general has been amazing because it has democratized information flow all around the world. And so it's an amazing resource. But as artificial intelligence gets smarter and more sophisticated, there are some nefarious actors out there who are interested in using their time on earth to scam people out of money or just create difficult situations. And so I think that information literacy is such an important skill for all of us, regardless of what we're doing in our lives or our careers, to be able to distinguish what's a reliable source and what's something that maybe needs to be checked out a little bit more. So while we started our journey online, building those relationships with reputable healthcare providers and building that relationship with our home care worker and getting out to learn more about the different companies and organizations in this space was so important, so that you can say, like you said, we could cut through the noise and really get to what was going to be meaningful for our family and our situation.
So you mentioned that you were an early adopter and consumer of our tech, BlueBell Connect. What made you curious enough to try and be part of the beta testing of it?
Yeah, I think for me, in a disease like dementia, where, as I previously compared it to cancer, there isn't really a set protocol around who are the healthcare providers or privately paid for caregiving support workers that are going to be a part of your family's ecosystem. And so what really appealed to me was the idea that, I have a younger sister who lives in Southern California, so she couldn't be part of the caregiving journey directly, but she certainly wanted to be informed. What's a way that we can put all of the information about our personal observations about what's happening with mom, so that if someone has to fill in, they know exactly what's going on. Any incidents that we've experienced or any changes in symptoms that we've experienced, making sure that everybody was on the same page without having to worry, okay, did I send this email to that person? Did I have the phone conversation with that person? And just having a central place to manage it, I think, was a very attractive idea for us. And so I think that families, especially if they are dispersed, and with our global world, it's not uncommon to have parents in one city or country and siblings in tons of other places. This is a really nice way to consolidate things that lets people add their own notes in about, say I had this conversation with mom on my birthday, she didn't remember who I was, or she didn't remember that it was my birthday, or whatever the case may be, to, okay, the doctor has asked that we adjust so-and-so medication to this dosage, and just keeping people on the same page, I think, is really important, because, the biggest risk that we have in situations like this is that people are acting on older, outdated information, right? And so having a place to keep everything consistent is really important.
Where did you find value in the services that Connect can provide?
Again, I think it was just having that one-stop shop of where everything is stored and letting multiple parties have access to it, so that in their decision making, when there with mom, either from a caregiving perspective or a medical treatment perspective. They're looking at the most up-to-date information that's coming from the family and any other party involved with the file.
In some other conversations we've had, you've talked about these kind of paradoxes that have occurred. You've thought about these contradictions that occur that make dementia care super hard. We've talked about living longer while denying, aging. How do you see that show up in your care journey?
Yeah, I think, like I said before, dementia is the type of thing that whether you're ready for it or not, whether you want to do it or not, you're really forced to confront mortality, right? For your loved one and even for what this means for yourself. Because I know the first thing I started doing was researching, okay, what's the genetic risk? Is this going to be me in 40 years? Because of course your mind goes to that and you're catastrophizing and thinking of what's the worst possible situation. Am I going to be at a point where I don't remember my kids at some point? Because, that just sounds like a fate worse than death. I never want to get to that stage. And so I think there was a lot of reflection that happened. And so part of why I wanted to start the website was to address some of these paradoxes because, yeah, we're living longer, but we continue to deny aging as a fact of life. That's not helpful. We are getting older. We are living longer. Arguably our bodies aren't meant to live as long as they are sometimes. And the science isn't certain on what even causes dementia. Like, why is it affecting some people and not? We're still trying to figure that out. The research is still in very early stages compared to some, maybe other long-standing chronic illnesses that we've started to manage as a Western world. I then talked about the paradox of we're a hyper-connected world, but we're increasingly alone. And so are we using our technologies for good and to build these communities, or are we withdrawing more into ourselves and feeling like we're alone? And, when it comes to dementia specifically, isolation is probably one of the worst things for both the patient and any of the caregivers involved, because being able to maintain that level of social stimulation can be so helpful to quality of life and the slowing of symptoms and the progression of the disease, the more that we stay engaged with each other, because I think there is some agreement that the act of engaging in a conversation is something that helps to fire the neurons in the brain and create the pathways where maybe it's slowed down in some other centers of the brain, but it's doing some positive good in that. We've also got, the paradox of what I talked about before. We've got this democratization of data, but almost an overwhelming sense of misinformation that's out there because people make things political and they take sides that maybe don't need to be taken. And so we're putting value judgments against some of the information that's coming up. And it's getting harder for people that maybe don't have those tech skills or the general information literacy skills to determine what should I be paying attention to or what can I let fall by the wayside. And the final one is, we're in a society in the context of a larger healthcare system that is very unprepared for this disease, but it's a disease that is hard to predict. So how do you even manage for it? So it's definitely a really complicated problem that's in front of us right now. I am really excited that even in the first few months that this website has been around, it's attracted a little bit of attention to the point that I've been invited to participate in a roundtable discussion early in December that's going to start the process of how do we get a coordinated response to this disease put in place by multiple orders of government, by the various nonprofit organizations or other bodies that are out there, and by, the healthcare system itself, so that we can start to coordinate and really move this forward. Because with dementia still being somewhat maybe a junior considered disease in the overall context of some of the things that we're managing, there's a lot of people doing really good work, but they're not necessarily connected to each other. And so we're not harnessing the collective power that we have to make that difference. And so, I'm really excited to be part of that conversation and hopefully part of the solution that we're going to be able to develop.
We've talked about the idea that we're so connected now. There's so many ways of, cell phones or text messaging or FaceTime, all these kind of things to make us so intimately connected. But we're also have these points of isolation and feeling alone. What did that, where did that manifest for you?
I think the loneliness was a really big challenge for me in the early stages because The other thing is I'm really close with my dad, and I have been throughout mom's journey with this disease. But, you know, you also have that sense of wanting to protect. He was living with mom 24/7. And so I didn't want to burden him with what I was feeling because I knew he was already going through so much. I didn't feel like I had that community because even as I was talking to friends, there was maybe one or two people that were dealing with it. But in one case, her parent has already passed on, so was no longer around. In the other case, it's just not someone that I have the opportunity to chat with very often because we both have really busy lives. And so feeling like I had anyone that could really understand what was happening was a very difficult part of the journey, even in talking to my sister, because, she's in another country. She's not seeing what I'm seeing on a daily basis, right? And so I think it was that first sense of, my God, how am I going to manage this? My husband had just lost his father recently as well. My kids are at an age where they're, becoming teenagers. And so they're going through their own developmental challenges and, that stage of life where they're really asserting their independence and they don't want to deal with this kind of thing. Right. So, yeah, it seemed like there were a lot of factors all at once. And that's why I'm really glad that, I was able to build some community through the Alzheimer's Society in particular, um, and just have a group of people that I could talk to about these things. And they knew what I was going through. I didn't have to explain. I didn't have to apologize. And I think to that point of we're all living longer and we're denying aging, I think because we deny aging so well, we don't really know how to confront the period of mourning and grief. And we're always looking to make people feel better. Well, I don't want to be made to feel better. Sometimes I just want to have the space to cry or to feel sad. I don't need anyone to do anything. I just want someone to be there. So in having groups of people that have gone through the same experience, it's a bit easier.
We have access to so much data out there, so much, quantitative data, numbers, metrics, all these kind of things, but the amount of information we get from it is not as much as, at least I've found, as much as can be helpful. Is there any information that you wish you had that someone would plainly give to you and said, Anoushka, here you go. This is some information that you need to know to be successful, instead of having to go and find it yourself?
Think what I wish I had known at the start of the journey is that all of the emotions are normal and don't beat yourself up for having them. I was upset with myself at how angry I was and for how long a period of time I spent in that stage. But as I reflect on that, in light of mom's passing, that was totally legitimate, right? It was a shock to all of us that mom ended up with this diagnosis. It wasn't fair. It's still not fair that this happened to her. And I think the guilt comes very soon after. What could we have done to prevent this? Did I do the right things soon enough? Patience is always something that I've struggled with in my fortes. And, I know that there were times that I was short with mom. And fortunately, towards the end, she wouldn't remember me having done that. So it made me feel a little bit better. But you don't feel good in the moment when you're getting frustrated or, Mom, I already told you this. Like, do you not remember, kind of a thing? Of course I knew she didn't remember, but it's hard to manage, right? So I kind of wish I had had a bit more guidance around what the emotional roller coaster was going to be like, and that it's normal. It's part of the journey. You're probably still going to feel terrible about it, but just let it play out.
As I understand, South Asian families, they carry these unspoken rules about who steps in, how care should look, who's responsible for what. What parts of that helped you and what parts of that made it harder for you?
So I'm the oldest child. I'm the one that's here in Edmonton. So we never had the explicit conversation. But yeah, definitely, I think there was certainly a sense that I was going to be the one to step in. Again, from my perspective, it was my privilege and my honor to do that because I really believe that, my parents did so much for me growing up. I wanted to be there to help them when the time came. And so I think for me, I'm glad that I took the time to have that conversation with myself and then, of course, my husband about, okay, what's my relationship to my career going to be so that I don't have regrets in 20 years? And I think that was a really big driver for me is how do I make sure I'm living my life in a way that teaches a good lesson to my kids and helps me not feel bad about the decisions that I made. So, could I have a lot more money now if I had stayed where I was? Absolutely. Do I regret the time that I had and the flexibility that I had over the past year to support my parents with everything that mom needed? Absolutely not. I am so glad that that happened.
Where do you see the biggest gaps between cultural expectations and the Canadian or Alberta healthcare system?
I think just a willingness to talk about it. COVID was a horrible experience for all of us, but if there is one bright light that came out of it, I think it's that we're much more willing to talk about what mental health and wellness now means. We've really reduced the stigma around that because we were forced to confront it with isolation just being, something that was almost mandated by law for such a long time. What I'm hoping is that we can get to a point where cultural communities start to release some of the very harmful myths and stereotypes around, dementia is the type of disease that comes to you because of karma that you've put into the universe, or dementia is a disease that comes to you because you didn't make good life choices earlier in your time on earth. And so I think the more that we're able to talk about it, the more that we're able to see how universal it is and how non-discriminating the disease is in picking its victims and how any of us can really be a target for it, the more it levels the playing field and causes us all to confront the situation. Okay, this is something that this is staring us in the face as a larger society. What are we going to do together to be part of managing it well?
What conversations do you want South Asian families to start having right now before they're in a crisis, having trying to figure out how do they navigate it?
If you're seeing something and if your gut is telling you that something isn't right, don't dismiss it. It is hard to accept the reality that maybe someone isn't going to have the same level of functionality that you're used to them having, but take the time to talk to a doctor, find a medical professional, do your research, ask the questions, and get access to that help, because there are so many resources that are out there that can make such a meaningful difference in a patient's quality of life if we access them early enough. So don't dismiss the feelings. Don't pretend that they're not happening, and take the time to seek help, have the conversations, and get access to the supports that exist.
This one may be a similar question, but if there's a daughter in a South Asian family listening right now and starting to notice changes, what would you suggest that she do first?
You know what? The Alzheimer's Society has an awesome set of people that are called system navigators, and their job is to help you move through the pieces of what can seem like a very overwhelming system. I found out about them after I had already started my journey, and so I didn't call upon that resource, but call them, make contact, ask a question. They are there to help. I can't believe how many services that they provide free of charge to families. We benefited from so many courses, programs. They've even got, a loaner library of books and other materials that people can take out to do reading on their own time. Make that call, ask the question, and know that you're not alone and that there is an established infrastructure out there to support people in what they're going through with this disease.
Okay, that's interesting. Do you think that the Alzheimer's Society themselves equip multicultural families in the way they need to be cared? Or do you think that, given the fact that they grew up in Goa and they have that cultural identity, your mom spoke English, crime, do you think that she adapted to the Canadian Caucasian approach of care?
Yeah, and I do want to say I am now a volunteer with the Alzheimer's Society of Alberta and the Northwest Territories, and I'm really excited to be part of a program that they started about a year and a half ago, which is specifically focused on outreach to cultural communities. So there's a whole stream of work that's happening specifically with the South Asian community. I think the Filipino community is the other major pillar of focus, but there is recognition now that we do need to deliver services and have supports delivered in maybe a different way than we have done for what I'm going to say is mainstream Canadians. And so that program is up and running. I'm very excited to be a part of it. And so I think there's a good recognition on the part of the Alzheimer's Society that there are specific needs to various different cultural communities. And I'm really excited that they've started to address that.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So great work on that. We're going to shift a little bit into a round called lightning round. Ready?
Sounds good.
What is one small routine that you kept steady during caregiving?
For me or for my mom?
For you.
I was really bad at that, actually. I don't think I did a good job of it at all, to be honest. It's something that we talk about, but I was terrible at taking the advice. I try to go for walks as much as possible, and that's kind of my de-stress time.
Okay. What is one of your smartest shortcuts or workarounds as a caregiver?
Oh boy, I don't really know that I got that sophisticated. Trying to keep mom in a routine was one of the biggest things. So I called her every morning. She had a day timer that we would work through, that she would try to write down her recollections of major things that had happened the previous day. And we just kind of have a short chat about that to, again, get that conversation muscle going. I don't know that that's a shortcut. It definitely was very time intensive, but the setting of routine was really important to her stability and ability to manage her own symptoms.
What's one sign of burnout you wish people didn't ignore?
The emotional side, it's very taxing. So taking the time to find a friend or a therapist or a support group that you can just have those conversations with is super important.
What's one caregiving task you ended up being surprisingly good at?
Oh boy, I don't know. I think honestly, just the project management that I was able to provide my family in terms of keeping us all on the same track and making sure everyone had access to the same information.
What's something you thought would be hard, but turned out to be reasonably easy?
Once I got myself into the mindset, being grateful for the good days. There were some great days where it felt like mom was just mom again. And I really learned to appreciate and treasure those moments.
Were there any South Asian or maybe Goan comfort dishes that, when you eat it, reminded you of the good times before this all?
Great cook, and she always cooked everything. So anytime she would cook really was always a treat.
What's one cultural value you hope future generations or your kids hold on to?
The importance of family.
What's one South Asian or Goan cultural practice that brought comfort during your mom's dementia?
I think the maintenance of community. There's a group of families in town that don't have any blood relatives in town. And so we've taken to spending the major holidays together, Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter, all that. And that's been a huge source of comfort and just routine and stability for us. So even when mom was struggling, it was great to have that network.
What's one early symptom you think families often overlook too often?
The forgetfulness, because it's the easiest to explain away.
What's one simple phrase you use to help your extended family understand dementia?
Mom's still mom. She hasn't stopped being her. She may struggle with some memories, but she hasn't changed who she is.
What's one thing people think dementia means that isn't actually true?
I think, unfortunately, a lot of people think it's something that should cause them to withdraw and not treat the person the same way and not maintain the same level of friendship or care or conversation that they used to. And that was really hard. There were some people that I think were quite reluctant to engage with mom because they didn't know how to be around her. So again, the more we have this conversation, the more that we remove that anxiety or uncertainty.
What's one question you wish caregivers would ask their doctor sooner?
What do I need to do next? I think we're often afraid to ask open-ended questions like that, but when we don't know what we're dealing with, sometimes that's where we need to start.
What's one small change that you would make that would make the healthcare system easier to navigate?
Providing more proactive planning materials and resources for families that are noticing memory changes in their loved one.
It's like you knew my second question. It's going to be right after that. What's a community resource specifically you wish more people know about?
The Alzheimer's Society. honestly, I had heard of them for years, didn't know what they do. They do some amazing work.
What movie do you rewatch when you need comfort?
When I need comfort, I don't know. I've got a couple of favorites. The original Rush Hour is always good for getting my mind off of things. I love that one.
What's your favorite smell from your childhood?
Boy, probably the smell of my grandmother's cooking.
What's one hobby or interest you'd love to return to now?
Getting out for walks. It's my daily time with no kids, nobody, just me, my headphones and my music. And even in the really cold temperatures, I like to do that.
I don't do cold. Anoushka, I don't do cold.
Oh, I don't do cold either, but I mean, I've prepared myself for it. So,
What's one quality you inherited from your mom that you're grateful for?
oh boy, certainly not her patience, but I think her wanting to help other people. I'd like to think that I have tried to live that as best I can.
And not a lightning round question, but I always like to leave the guests with the last parting thoughts or words before we close. So, do you have anything you'd like to say to the folks that are listening?
You're not alone. More people than you think are going through this. They may not all want to talk about it, but there is a community for you out there. So find your people and hold on to them because they will be a big part of how you can manage and navigate your way through this really terrible disease.
Anoushka, well, thank you for joining us. I know the listeners are really going to take away quite a bit, whether we're talking about the soggy sandwich, whether we talk about your perspectives of, South Asian or Goan or Indian care within the Albertan system, or just, giving up your career and looking after your mom and making that the priority. I think that there's going to be a lot of takeaways and nuggets that are going to impact people. So I just want to thank you for being here. Thank you for being vulnerable and talking it through. I know it can be probably hard to do that. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Andy. I really appreciate it.
And to our listeners, thank you for being here as well. If today's conversation resonated with you, follow the Dementia Collective wherever you get your podcast. And don't forget to share this episode with someone who might benefit. The sharing of these episodes helps it bring to more voices, more people to hear, and we can make a larger difference for dementia in our communities. If you'd like to help us grow this movement, please consider becoming a member of the Village on Patreon. Among the benefits, you'll like early access to every episode. You'll get to ask a question to all of the guests, as we heard with Anoushka earlier. Plus, you get the satisfaction of helping powerful voices like Anoushka's reach more caregivers around the world. And finally, if you're on your own caregiving journey, remember, you are not alone. We're here at BlueBell to help you connect with the supports and resources that truly fit your family's needs. Until next time, remember, you are strong, you're not alone, and you're doing something that matters more than you know. I'll see you in the next one.